We were in a concrete bunker someplace in the Alaskan tundra in late November 2003, and the cold was biting at the walls. Although it was known as Fort Wainwright, this outpost seemed to be in the middle of nowhere. At the time, I was a young private named Woodrow Woody Caulfield who had just completed basic training. The idea was that the tranquility out here would serve as a sharp contrast to the busy American bases. However, there was no calmness. It weighed heavily on the senses, as if concealed. The first nights passed without incident, with just the customary squeaks and moans of a weathered building to be heard. Whispers followed. They began softly, like leaves rustling in the breeze, but soon became a cacophony of screams, cries of pain, and the distinct sound of metal striking metal. Outside our fortifications, it sounded like a full-scale fight was unfolding. We would rush out, guns blazing, heart racing, and come up empty-handed. A vast, desolate wasteland blanketed in snow, bathed in the soft light of the moon. We first thought it was just the wind or some kind of animal, according to our grizzled veteran sergeant Harlan Hawk Hawkins. However, the frequency and intensity of the noises increased. A series of distinct voices began to shout commands in a language that none of us could decipher, although it had a faint Germanic quality to it. The bunker seemed to be trembling one night from the sheer volume of the noise. Slender Louisianan Private Elroy Fitzgerald claimed to have seen formations of flickering shadows moving over the snow outdoors. Hawk, with a glum expression on his face, eventually admitted that something was wrong. "All right, Caulfield Fitzgerald," he said, his voice strained with anxiety. "Seize your equipment. The archives are being searched." Hidden in the bunker's darkest recesses was a cramped, dusty chamber housing the archives. The walls were adorned with shelves that held a collection of old books and dirty boxes. According to Hawk, this bunker served as a listening station during World War II and has a lengthy history. He reasoned that maybe we may unearth some historical documents, such as weather reports, that could shed light on the mysterious occurrences. After hours of poring over the old records, all we came up with were boring reports and inventory lists. Upon reaching our breaking point, Fitz retrieved a small leather-bound notebook from a concealed container. The pages were fragile from age, and the cover was discolored and damaged. Carefully opening it, he felt his eyes expand. "Shh, Sergeant, listen to this," he said with a quiver in his voice. A soldier serving out of the bunker in 1943 owned the logbook. Ghostly shouts of combat and invisible footprints in the snow were only two of the frightening noises he recounted. He detailed the men's increasing paranoia and terror as they became convinced that the bunker was inhabited by the spirits of their comrades who had died there. He went so far as to bring up the peculiar German expressions they'd overheard, which he had subsequently determined belonged to a mountain division, said to have been swept away in the snow. A shiver of ice terror ran down my spine as I read the soldier's horrific testimony. This wasn't a random occurrence in the weather or a natural disaster. This was different, some specter that had been circling the area for decades. Other journals were located, and they all supported the first. Soldiers from various time periods, each recounting the same horrifying ordeals. My spine tingled at the sight of the 1968 date on the last entry in the journal. The text only stated, "They're inside now." The lights in the archives suddenly flickered and went out at that same moment. An ear-piercing scream resounded from the hallway outside, soon followed by the distinct sound of swiftly approaching boots striking metal. While holding the diary close to his chest, Fitz let out a low moan. Hawk, his countenance pallid but determined, lifted his gun. With a strain in his voice, he muttered, "Caulfield, get ready." Suddenly, just outside the door, the noises ceased. While listening carefully, we held our breath. The dense and oppressive quiet persisted, broken only by the furious beating of our hearts. Then, in that guttural German, a low whisper almost touching my ear. What transpired that night remained unspoken between us. The following morning, without providing any reason, we were transported away. Because of structural instability, the bunker was abandoned, according to the official report. But the reality is something I am aware of. A mysterious presence dwells in that remote Alaskan settlement, one that speaks only in the shadows and patiently awaits its chance to act. Story 2, Arid Wasteland. The very name has a foreboding tone. In 2008, I was assigned to a reconnaissance unit while stationed at Fort Irwin. Hi, I'm Darnell Rip Ripley, and I've had some hair-raising experiences out in the desert. However, this narrative is distinct from the others. As a standard procedure, our 4-man crew was to sweep a certain zone close to the Nevada border. Our commander, Sergeant Cordell Mac McMillan, was a grizzled old combat vet, known for being very composed when things got rough. Along with them, we had the reserved Oregonian Private First Class Evander Van Vance and the quick-witted New Jerseyan specialist Rosalind Rosie Perkins. The objective was simple: keep an eye out for suspicious behavior and report back after patrolling the perimeter. As the sun rose, casting a kaleidoscope of orange and purple light over the sand dunes, we started off on our journey. There was relative silence in the desert, far too tranquil. At least once per hour, we stayed in touch with base by radio. Our final planned check-in was phoned in by Mac at noon. It was business as usual, void thereafter. No matter how many times we attempted to get in touch with them, all we got was static. My role was to assist in the deployment of a search and rescue team. Unease gripped me as we drew nearer to their last known whereabouts. We were accompanied solely by the faint sound of our vehicle's engine as we traversed the expansive and desolate desert. Then we beheld it, in the shape of a circle, approximately 20 feet in diameter, perfectly made. Their bags, canteens, guns and boots were all neatly put out within the circle. Except for them, everything else was present. Nothing had transpired, and there were no footsteps emanating from the circle either. It seemed as if they had mysteriously disappeared. I felt shivers go down my spine as the desert wind made a melancholy sound through the vacant gear. After days of searching, we came up empty-handed. Their official status was missing in action, which meant they were assumed dead. Something more evil, however, had to have happened. I felt it in my heart. More than simply lives are lost in the desert's hidden mysteries at times. All that it takes is a haunting reminder of what was lost, memories, identities and lives. For months, thoughts of that flawless circle imprinted in the sand plagued my nightmares. It stood as a mute testimony to the mysterious, unfathomable powers that permeate the Mojave and have the ability to vanish without a trace. They vanished into thin air in the desert, and now we're stuck wondering why. Who or what is responsible for the disappearance of Mac, Van and Rosie? It's a haunting mystery that continues to terrify me to this day. Story 3, located in North Carolina, Fort Bragg, 2012. During that time, I was a sergeant and I was in charge of leading a squad through night exercises on the expansive training grounds. My name is Cassius Cash Claiborne, and I have always taken great pleasure in my intellectual capacity and my capacity to maintain composure in high-pressure situations. But the events that transpired that evening were completely illogical. Our night vision goggles gave up a faint light that was the only thing that could be seen through the blackness. The air was heavy with humidity. We were practicing radio communication by sending and receiving coded signals as we made our way through the thick jungle. Suddenly, a voice could be heard crackling across the communication system. It was as clear as the sun, and it cut through the typical static. "I am Command, and I would like to congratulate the Bravo Squad. Proceed to the coordinates 34 to 87 Alpha Delta, as shown on the grid. Gratitude is due." It had a loud, powerful voice with a unique drawl that was characteristic of the South. I did a frown. Those coordinates were not being practiced during the exercise. After consulting with my lieutenant, Whitaker Whip Thornton, I discovered that he had not delegated any instructions of this kind. This is Bravo Squad, and I am command. You should verify those coordinates. It's over. A little later, the voice was heard again. It is confirmed, 34 to 87. Alpha Delta is the grid. Sergeant, it ought to be in order. Move your team around. It's over. Despite its familiarity, the voice had an unpleasant quality that made it difficult to ignore. Although I was unable to identify it, it caused a chill to run down my spine. The whip, who was also perplexed, gave me the order to continue with caution. We made our way through the thick foliage while following the coordinates that were strange to us. The atmosphere became thicker with a sensation of expectation that was almost physical, and the forest became more dense. Finally, we arrived at the site that had been assigned. An enormous oak tree stood out as the dominant feature of the little clearing. A metal hatch was located at the foot of the tree, partly concealed by the dense vines that covered it. While we approached with caution, we lifted our firearms. There was a tingling feeling on the back of my neck, and it seemed as if we were being watched. When I finally managed to pry open the hatch, I saw a slender stairway that led down into the darkness. This is Bravo Squad, and I am command. We have arrived at the spot that was assigned. It's over. There is no sound. We made another attempt to get in touch with command, but we did not get a response. While the rest of us plunged into the unknown, Whip, with a melancholy expression on his face, gave the order for 2 men to protect the perimeter. Inside, the air was stuffy and chilly, with a fragrance that was reminiscent of wet dirt and something metallic. There was a tiny compartment made of concrete that was accessible via the stairs. Outside, we discovered a number of metal containers placed against the sides of the building. We opened one with extreme caution. It included a multitude of papers that were stapled together in thick folders and affixed with the words, "Top Secret." During the course of our investigation, we came to the realization that we had stumbled onto a secret collection of classified intelligence records that dated back to the Vietnam War. They provided specifics of clandestine activities, confidential agreements, and knowledge that had the potential to alter the trajectory of history. Afterward, Whip became aware of something, a deteriorating image that was concealed inside one of the files. The photograph depicted a group of soldiers striking a pose in front of the same oak tree that we had seen earlier. He was the same guy whose voice we had heard over the radio, and he was standing in the middle of the gathering. He had a speech pattern that was reminiscent of the South. A renowned character who had passed away in 1970, General Thurgood Thunder Thompson, was recognized as the individual shown in the description that was placed under the photograph. After some time had passed, we eventually found out that General Thompson had been engaged in a number of highly secret missions, the majority of which had never been formally published. Both the coordinates that he had provided for us and the location of the secret stash gave us the impression that he was guiding us there from beyond the grave. Instantaneously, the papers were taken away, and the whole occurrence was documented for future reference. We were given the directive to never again discuss the matter. Nevertheless, the recollection of that night, in which the reverberating voice of a deceased general led us to a concealed reality, continues to torment me. It served as a disturbing reminder that there are certain secrets that cannot be buried, not even death. Story 4. Afghanistan in the year 2011. A province known as Kunar. There was a spot where the mountains themselves appeared to be whispering secrets, and the shadows contained more than just gloom. My name is Brennan Brick Holloway, and I was a member of a small detachment that was involved in operations in the Pech Valley, which is known for being a very hazardous place. While we were deep into enemy territory, we were conducting a long-range reconnaissance expedition. What we were tasked with doing was gathering information on the activities of the insurgents and identifying probable targets for airstrikes. The terrain was rough and brutal, and the air was thin and chilly. We had been traveling for many days at that point. When we were setting up camp in a tight valley one evening, we saw that there was activity on the ridge that was above us. We were being approached by a huge number of troops who were well equipped, loaded with weapons. It was instantly assumed that these were hostile fighters, so we sought shelter without delay. On the other hand, when they got closer, we were aware of something peculiar. They were dressed in uniforms of the United States. We approached hesitantly and introduced ourselves as members of the United States Army. It was disturbing to hear their answer. Introducing themselves as the 118th Infantry Regiment, a regiment that we had never heard of before, they stated their identity. In their statement, they stated that they were conducting a covert operation in the region. It seemed as if their boss, a captain with a severe visage who introduced himself as Holden Hawk Hawthorne, was taken aback over our presence. He inquired about our instructions, our purpose, and our unit identity throughout the conversation. The inquiries he asked were pointed and accusing in nature. We responded in an honest manner, but he did not seem to be persuaded. After that, he gave us the command to take a step back and to stay in the ravine until further consideration. During our argument, we insisted that we were following our own independent commands. What he did was merely reiterate his instruction, his tone being icy and unyielding. What was it about his eyes that was so appealing? A peculiar and out-of-place face, as if he were not really there in the moment. We were outgunned and outnumbered by this enemy. Despite our reluctance, we complied. During the remaining hours of the night, we remained in the ravine and watched the Ghost Battalion make its way across the mountains. They were very exact, very disciplined, and their motions were almost ghostly. Next morning, they were nowhere to be seen. Without leaving any traces behind, we proceeded with our task while simultaneously informing our superiors about the incident. They responded in a manner that was much more uncomfortable than the conversation itself. They told us that there was no such thing as the 118th Infantry Regiment being used in the military. Other than our unit, there were no American forces who were participating in operations in that region. Everything, including the documents and the deployment logs, was examined by us. There was no sign of the 118th among the ruins. It seemed as if they had never been a part of time. On the other hand, we had witnessed them. They had been contacted by us. It was the icy steel of their weapons that we had experienced. We had come across a highly advanced enemy outfit that was camouflaged as American troops, according to the official explanation. However, I was aware, on a more fundamental level, that there was something more at play. There were troops from another period and another world that temporarily intersected with our own, and they were like phantoms. The 118th was just like that. I continue to be troubled by the recollection of that experience. The unsettling feeling that we had seen something that ought not to exist, the sight of those American uniforms, and the sound of their footsteps on the rough terrain all contributed to the whole experience. There are a lot of mysteries that are hidden among the mountains of the Pet Valley, and I feel that some of them should be left alone. Story 5. The odor of decay and gunpowder was dense that hung heavily in the air, and the humidity was oppressive. Cambodia in the year 2015. The Khmer Rouge were still present in a distant forest zone, and we were working along with the Cambodian army to eliminate any remaining Khmer Rouge members. My name is Declan Dex O'Malley, and I have always been fascinated by history and the echoes of the generations who came before me. However, there are instances when it is optimal to let the past alone. During our hunt, we came upon a temple complex that was in a state of disrepair, a complex of overgrown ruins and secret rooms. During the course of the fighting, I found myself separated from my team and sought refuge in a secluded and dark nook. My eyes were drawn to something that was shining brightly in the dark light as I traveled around the region. It was a kris, a classic dagger from Southeast Asia, with a serpentine blade that was beautifully etched with ancient markings. It was resting on a little stone altar, and it seemed to be waiting for me to come and take it. I was compelled to reach out and grab it because of the peculiar appeal it had. I felt a burst of electricity flow through my body the minute my fingers closed around the hilt of the weapon. My mind was inundated with pictures of burning towns, people screaming, and the horrors of war as I staggered backwards, gasping for oxygen from the experience. They were not recollections that I had. The kris has a long and deadly history, and they were echoes, vestiges of that past. I made an effort to let go of the weapon, but my hand was not willing to comply. My body and my mind seemed to be under the control of the kris. It was as if it had a grip on me. I held it in my hands in the hopes of severing the link, but the pictures persisted, becoming more vivid and horrifying as they progressed. I was unable to go to sleep that night. My life was ruined by the dreams, which were unrelenting and terrifying. I was able to see wars that took place centuries ago, experience the agony of many victims, and hear their cries in silence. My pulse was beating. I was soaked in perspiration, and I was holding the kris firmly in my hand when I woke up. I attempted to tell my team about the kris and the visions the next day, but I was unable to find the words to express what I was feeling. It seemed as if the firearm had hushed me and taken away my ability to speak. It was the echoes of the past that caused me to become reclusive, paranoid, and tormented. Afterward, the accidents began to occur. Initially, Private Finn Gallagher suffered a broken leg as a result of tripping over a root while on reconnaissance. After that, Sergeant Mal Mitchell fired his weapon by mistake, and he came dangerously close to hitting another soldier. Each occurrence was preceded by my handling the kris, which was followed by the revival of the images. At that moment, I became aware that the kris was afflicted with a curse. It was a vessel of evil energy that was infecting everyone around me, and it was a conduit for the violence and misery that it had seen over the course of the millennia. I was obligated to get rid of it. I made my way back to the temple, specifically to the nook where I had discovered the kris. The hand that I was using to set it back on the altar was shaking. While I was turning to go, I became aware of a voice that reverberated throughout the ruins. It was an old and malicious voice. Even if it was spoken in a language that I was unable to comprehend, the implication was very clear. The kris would not be abandoned. Eventually, it would make its way back. Despite the whisper following me through the woods, I managed to escape the temple. Despite the fact that I have never seen the kris again, I can still sense its existence, like a shadow that lives on the periphery of my mind. Even though the dreams have lessened, the memories continue to haunt me. They serve as a frightening reminder of the cursed weapon and the evil that it unleashed. Story 6. Located in France, the Argonne Forest, 2018 year. The purpose of our visit was to participate in a historical remembrance, which included following in the footsteps of American troops who fought during World War I. To introduce myself, my name is Emerson M. Quincy, and I have always been captivated by the Great War, particularly by the tales of bravery and self-sacrifice that are engraved into the very basis of Europe. Whatever it was that we came upon in that woodland, however, was beyond anything that I could have ever imagined. As we made our way down a track that was well marked, we were approaching the location of a particularly bloody fight. The air was fresh and chilly, and the leaves could be heard rustling underfoot, indicating that fall was on the way. Following our entrance into a deep portion of the forest, a peculiar hush settled over us. The lack of noise was not the only thing that was noticeable. There was a distinct emptiness, as if the very air had been pulled out of the location. The birds stopped chirping, the breeze stopped whispering through the trees, and even our own footsteps felt muted, as if they were being swallowed up by the suffocating silence. When we stared at one another, nervousness began to seep into our expressions. The situation was not right, completely and utterly incorrect. We proceeded on our way, the stillness becoming more oppressive with each step that we took. After that, we found them. The skeletons, remains of soldiers who had been dead for a very long time, were dispersed among the trees and partially buried in the vegetation. The fact that they were present everywhere was a quiet testimony to the bloodshed that had previously taken place in this location. We discovered weapons that had rusted, clothing that were torn, and bits and pieces of trenches and dugouts. It seemed as if time had stopped, and the battlefield remained in a condition of complete quiet over the whole conflict area. Despite the fact that our voices were muffled and our thoughts were whirling at the magnitude of the disaster, we walked amid the skeleton bones. After then, our historian, Lieutenant Winifred Winnie Cartwright, became aware of something. A little book with a leather binding was discovered laying next to one of the skeletons. As she gently lifted it up, the pages were brittle from the passage of time. The entry was a journal that had been written by a young American soldier. There was a noticeable increase in the level of stillness. As Winnie read aloud from the diary, it was almost as if the forest itself was paying attention. During the combat, the soldier recalled the panic, the turmoil, and the frantic struggle for survival that was taking place. His writings included descriptions of the thunderous sound of artillery, the screaming of those who had been injured, and the terrible calm that followed each onslaught. In his writing, he described a peculiar occurrence, which he described as a sudden and unexplainable suspension of all sound, as if the whole planet had lost its hearing. In his account, he recounted seeing dark beings moving through the forest. These figures were quiet and lethal, as if they were reapers coming to collect souls. A feeling of fear and apprehension came over us as Winnie read the last entry. In his writing, the soldier described the return of the stillness, which was more profound and oppressive than it had been before, as well as the rising worry that they were not alone. The post was concluded with a single statement that was both terrifying and eerie. The silence is listening. With our pulses racing in our chests, we turned the page of the journal away. It seemed as if the stillness that surrounded us was surrounding us and smothering us. Amidst the oppressive silence that followed us like a shadow, we hastily grabbed our belongings and went back over our previous steps. Nothing ever came out of our mouths about what we went through in the Argonne forest. In accordance with the official narrative, we had discovered a portion of the battlefield that had not been disturbed, a location where the reverberations of the fight continued to be heard. But I am aware of the reality. There was more to the quiet than simply the lack of sound. It was a presence, something old and malicious, something that both listened and waited for its opportunity to act. Story 7. Located in Panama, the Darien Gap is home to a thick rainforest. 2019 year. We were a part of a combined operation with Panamanian troops, which included chasing down drug traffickers over some of the most hazardous terrain on the planet. To introduce myself, my name is Griffin Griff Hayes, and I have always taken great pleasure in my navigational abilities, namely my capacity to find my way about, even in the most confused of circumstances. Nevertheless, even the most seasoned navigators have the potential to get disoriented in the Darien Gap. Moreover, there are occasions when it is not simply their way that they lose. We had to depend on global positioning systems, GPS, and topographical maps in order to navigate through the thick jungle. We had to chop our way through the thick foliage, through the deep humidity, and through the buzzing of mosquitoes. During the course of our assignment, we were tasked with preventing a cocaine shipment from arriving at the Colombian border. Over the course of many days, we had been following their dim path through the bush in order to locate them. After that, our GPS gadgets began to have malfunctions. The signals started to behave in an unpredictable manner, moving from one spot to another until eventually going away completely. When we examined our compasses, we saw that they were whirling madly and doing nothing. Even when we brought out our paper maps, they seemed to be incorrect. Despite the fact that the rivers flowed in the other way and the routes lead to dead ends, the markers did not correspond to the landscape. We were unable to find our way. I am completely and totally disoriented. It was difficult for us to go backwards and retrace our steps, since the jungle appeared to be shifting and changing all around us. The trails that we were acquainted with vanished, and they were replaced by thickets and ravines that were impossible to traverse. We found ourselves ensnared in a verdant maze, with the trees closing in on us, and the only sound that could be heard was the rustle of animals that we could not see. After that, our communications expert, Sergeant Ainsley Ace Harrington, uncovered a finding that was quite unsettling. With some difficulty, he was able to establish a radio link with a Panamanian outpost that was located nearby. His explanation included our predicament, the breakdown of our technology, and our sense of confusion. The reaction caused a chill to run down each of our spines. The officer from Panama informed us that we were not the first ones to arrive. In the same region, other patrols, both military and civilian, had reported having encounters that were comparable to their own. There were problems with the GPS, the compass, and maps that seemed to shift right in front of their eyes. The name they gave it was the Lost Zone. He cautioned us to remain in our current location, to preserve our items, and to wait for assistance. When he entered the Lost Zone, he described it as being similar to entering another dimension. He described it as a region where the rules of physics seemed to collapse and shatter. He reported that some patrols had not been seen or heard from again. We were in the Lost Zone for 3 days, during which time the forest was closing in on us, and the quiet was broken by the calls of exotic birds and the rustle of predators that we were unable to see. Our mood was deteriorating with each passing hour, and we were forced to restrict our food and water supplies. When, by some miracle, our GPS gadgets came back to life, we were on the point of giving up hope. The signals were unmistakable, and the coordinates included no errors. They led us out of the Lost Zone, and it seemed like we were walking out of a dream as we followed them. The event that we had at the Darien Gap was never discussed by any of us. A fault in the equipment and a mistake made by a person were the official explanations. But I am aware of the reality. Indeed, the Lost Zone exists. It is a place where the lines that separate different realities grow hazy, where maps lose their significance, and where the jungle itself seems to be working against you. I have a strong desire to never return to that location. Story 8. The bone-chilling wind howled over the icy terrain, bringing with it the sounds of gunshots that could be heard in the distance. 2017 on the Korean to the north were at an all-time high, and we were stationed close to the demilitarized zone, DMZ. I'm Reese R.A.P. Montgomery, and I've been through my fair share of injuries, both in the course of my training and when I've been in battle. On the other hand, what I saw that evening defied any and all attempts at medical explanation. We were on a night patrol, and the only thing that could be seen in the pitch black was the little light coming from our night vision goggles. We were caught off guard by an ambush, which was shown by a hail of gunfire coming from the shadows. When Private Indigo Indy Nelson was struck, a bullet went through his leg and ripped it apart. He shrieked out in agony before falling to the ground in a heap. During the time that I was crawling to Indy's side, we returned fire and suppressed the opposing position. Even though the bone in his leg was broken, he was bleeding heavily. I attempted to stop the flow of blood by using a tourniquet, but it was not even close to being effective. He was rapidly losing his strength. When I looked over, I saw a person standing next to me. There was a lady who was dressed in an old-fashioned military medic outfit, and her face was hiding behind shadows. She got down on her knees next to Indy, her hands working in a swift and effective manner. In addition to applying a pressure bandage and injecting him with something, she also murmured words of consolation to him in a language that I was unable to comprehend. I was unable to fathom what was taking place, so I observed in completely astonished silence. This lady was who exactly? I was curious about her origins. On patrol with us, there were no other medical personnel present. It just took a few minutes for Indy's bleeding to cease. His breathing became more regular, and the color started to return to his face. With awe and admiration in his eyes, he turned his gaze to the lady. He made an effort to speak, but she intervened by placing a finger on her lips, which silenced him. Afterward, she disappeared, not in any other way. It's gone. Indy's wound was examined by me. Because to the skilled application of the bandage, the bleeding ultimately came to an end. Despite the fact that the injection site was clean, I was unable to determine the chemical that she had used. I could not have imagined anything else I had ever seen. Indy was stabilized but was still in shock when we asked for a medical evacuation. Returning to the base, the medical staff was perplexed. The bandage, the injection site, and everything else were all inspected by them. Specifically, they said that the bandage was composed of a material that is no longer used by the military, and that the injection was a kind of coagulant that is not presently being manufactured. It was a marvel that Indy was able to survive, as they advised that he should have passed out. We explored the area where the ambush had taken place, but we were unable to locate any evidence of the spectral medical professional. It was determined that I had hallucinated and that the stress of the circumstance had caused my mind to play tricks on me. This was the official explanation. However, I am aware of what I saw. I observed a lady who played the role of a physician and saved Indy's life. The presence of a lady who must not have been there, a lady who disappeared without a trace into none. The recollection of that evening continues to torment me. There was the spectral physician, her motions were quiet, and her healing touch was strange. Was she a divine being? Is it a ghost? Is it a product of my own imagination? No, I am not sure. Nevertheless, I am aware that Indy is still alive as a result of her. In addition, I am able to accept it as a mystery. Story 9. The Champagne area in France is characterized by its undulating hills. It is 2020. We were a member of a construction team that was charged with constructing a new access road close to the location of a battleground that had been used during World War I. Sullivan Sully Rhodes is my name, and I have always shown a great deal of reverence for history, particularly the sacred ground that is Europe's battlefields. The things that we discovered on that day, however, were more than simply historical facts. The fabric of time was torn apart by this event. At that moment, the earth unexpectedly gave way as we were running a backhoe to excavate a portion of the slope. The backhoe lurched ahead and plunged into a deep hole as it approached this. The atmosphere was thick with dust and debris which obscured everything. After the dust had cleared, we found ourselves looking right into a trench. Specifically, a trench from World War I, not just any old trench. The floor was muddy and strewn with rubbish, and the walls were strengthened with sandbags and boards. We saw firearms that had rusted, helmets that had been abandoned, and bits of uniforms. Then we were able to see them. The soldiers. The individuals were dressed in uniforms from World War I and were looking at us with big, confused eyes. Their voices were filled with a mixture of bewilderment and anxiety as they spoke with us in French. They inquired about our identities, inquired about our origins, and inquired about the year. Our own voices were shaking with amazement as we responded to the question. The expressions on their faces were pallid, as if they had heard us speak in a language that was not their native tongue. Another soldier, a young guy with a worried expression on his face, pointed at my outfit. He was a member of the military. During his stuttering, he made a statement about Americans, but different. After that, he pointed to the backhoe, which was a contraption that he was unable to comprehend. In a low voice, he spoke the word demon. Despite our best efforts, they were unable to comprehend our explanations, which included the fact that we were from the future and that the conflict had come to an end. It seemed as if they were looking at us as if we were ghosts or apparitions from another universe. On the other hand, the trench started to disappear just as fast as it had emerged. It seemed as if the walls were shimmering, the troops were becoming transparent, and their voices reverberated into existence. The earth under our feet became more firm, and the trench vanished, leaving behind the hillside that we were used to seeing. When we finally managed to get out of the backhoe, our hearts were thumping in our chests, and our heads were spinning from the events that we had just experienced. When we glanced at one another, our cheeks were pale, and the only thing that broke the quiet was the distant roar of construction machinery. We informed our bosses about the occurrence, but they rejected it as a hallucination, claiming that it was a manifestation of the effects of working in the hot heat. In order to erase what we had seen, they gave us the order to proceed with the building activities. But I am aware of the reality. We had stumbled onto a time warp, a short look into the past, and a horrifying meeting with warriors who were locked in a permanent nightmare of battle. All of these things had occurred simultaneously. The recollection of that day continues to torment me. The expressions on those troops' faces, the look of bewilderment on their eyes, and the words of dread and perplexity that they murmured, they were vestiges of the past that had been revived for a short while before being consumed once again by the unrelenting passage of time. And we, the unwary observers, were left with the question that may never be answered. What happened to those troops who were stationed in the trench that was distorted through time? Story 10. Located in North Carolina at Camp Lejeune, it is 2021. On account of the dense fog that had come in from the Atlantic Ocean, the base was enveloped in a spooky quiet. To introduce myself, my name is Tiernan Ty Walker, and I have always considered fog to be frightening because of the way it obscures everything, transforming the familiar into something weird and unpredictable. In contrast, this fog was not like any other. Voices were born by it. It was a soft murmuring that began in the background, like the sound of leaves rustling in the breeze from a distance. Subsequently, the mumbling became more audible, eventually becoming into whispers, and distinct voices began to swirl about us in the fog. Initially, we believed that it was nothing more than the wind playing tricks on us, or maybe it was some sort of acoustic aberration. When it happened, however, the murmurs began calling out our names. They hushed us, whispering things that only we knew, things that we had never spoken with anyone else to anyone else. They spoke in hushed tones about our anxieties, our regrets, and our most profound insecurities. There were things that we had done that they murmured about, things that we wished we could reverse. The voices were all around us, permeating our minds and pushing us to the brink of insanity. They were everywhere. Our cheeks were pale, and our eyes were wide with dread and anxiety as we peered at each other across the room. It was impossible for us to trust anybody, even ourselves. Could the rumors have been true? On the other hand, were they only the result of our own imaginations, which were heightened by the fog? Private Juniper. June Calloway, a rookie recruit who had just completed his training, began to scream. As she urged the whispers to cease, she scratched at her ears with her claws. She said that they were ripping her apart when they were inside her brain. Even though we made an effort to calm her down, she was completely distraught and thought that she was going nuts. When it happened, the rumors became ominous. Suddenly, they began giving instructions, directives that were in direct opposition to our training, and commands that had the potential to result in our deaths. They instructed us to turn against one another, to destroy our equipment, and to remove ourselves from our places. Sergeant Atticus Ash Hayes, a seasoned veteran with steel nerves, pulled out his pistol. He was a veteran. The sound of his voice trembled as he aimed it toward the fog. His voice yelled out, "Who's there? Show yourselves." A terrifying and mocking sound that reverberated through the fog was produced by the whispers as they laughed. She informed him that they were everywhere and nowhere at the same time, that they were the voices of his conscience, and that they were the echoes of his previous life. They assured him that he would not be able to get away from them. For a number of hours the fog remained, and the murmurs became more louder, more relentless, and more frightening. We found ourselves ensnared in a nightmare, with our brains continuing to play tricks on us, and the lines between truth and illusion becoming more blurry. After then, the fog started to evaporate just as rapidly as it had first formed. After a while, the murmurs became less audible and were replaced by the noises that were already known to the base, such as the hum of generators, the distant shouting of drill instructors, and the chirping of crickets. Both of our faces were pale, and our bodies were shaking as we gazed at each other. Despite the fact that we had made it through the whispering in the fog, the encounter had left its impact on us. Nothing about us was the same now. We were aware of the darkness that was inside us, as well as the vulnerability of our own brains. Even though the murmurs had been muted for the time being, we were aware that they may come back at any moment. Story 11. Under the light of the hot sun, the huge, lonely expanse of the Nevada desert spread out in front of us, shimmering magnificently. The year 2022 at Nellis Air Force Base. As members of a reconnaissance team, we were charged with studying a series of peculiar signals that were coming from an outpost that had been abandoned for a very long time and was given the designation Echo 419. My name is Renegade Ridley, and I have always had a strong fascination with the unknown, with the secrets that are concealed in the nooks and crannies of the world that have been forgotten. On the other hand, what we discovered at Echo 419 was a mystery that made me feel goosebumps all over my body. In the midst of the Cold War, a distant listening station known as Echo 419 was constructed with the purpose of monitoring Soviet communications. After being deactivated some decades ago, it had been abandoned to deteriorate in the harsh conditions of the desert. According to the official documents, the outpost had been fully deserted, with all of its people and equipment being removed. However, the signs indicated that this was not the case. The signals were weak and occasional bursts of static, and they were intermingled with what gave the impression of voices that had been distorted. The frequency that they were using was one that was not used by any recognized military or civilian entity. This was coming from the Echo 419 location. As we made our way across the rugged terrain, our vehicles kicked up clouds of dust as we approached the outpost with caution. The outpost consisted of a group of low structures made of concrete that were encircled by a chain-link fence that was corroded, and some of the buildings were damaged. The main gate was wide open, and the guardhouse itself was deserted and in a state of disrepair. A feeling of anxiety began to take hold of us as soon as we approached the main complex. There was a tangible sensation of abandonment in the air, which was heavy and very motionless. There was complete silence and emptiness in the buildings, with the windows being black and empty. It seemed as if time had stopped, which had the effect of keeping the outpost in a condition of degeneration everlasting. One of our teams was tasked with securing the perimeter, while the other was tasked with making an investigation inside the main building. As a member of the second team, I was under the command of Sergeant Calloway Cal Quinn, a veteran who is known for maintaining his composure even while under intense strain. While we were carefully entering the main structure, we had our guns lifted, and our senses were on high alert. The inside had subdued lighting, the air was dense with dust, and there was a strong odor of rotting. Sheets were used to cover the furniture, and tarpaulins were used to cover the electrical equipment, as if the people who were living there had merely departed in a haste with the expectation that they would return soon. However, they had not reported back, not in the last several decades. Over the course of our journey inside the facility, we went from room to room, using our flashlights to illuminate the darkness. We came to offices, residential quarters, and a mess hall that were all hauntingly intact, as if they had been kept in time. We discovered an unfinished lunch on a table, personal things strewn around, and even a chess game that had been abandoned in the middle of a move. It was as if the people who were being occupied had disappeared into thin air. Following that, we arrived in the communications room. Surprisingly, the apparatus was still there and in good condition, with the dials and switches still in their original placements. Despite the fact that they were still hanging on their hooks, the headphones seemed to be waiting for someone to put them on. Additionally, the radio transmitter was located in the middle of the room, with its power light flashing very little. Taking a careful approach, Cal approached the transmitter while keeping his palm hovering over the power button. He glanced at us with a gloomy expression on his face. "Ready?" he said in a low voice. Our hearts were beating in our chests as we nodded our heads. It was Cal who turned the switch. It was then that the transmitter began to buzz, and the power light began to shine brightly. Then, we were able to hear them. It is the voices. They were the same voices that we had heard in the signals, but they were now more definite, crisper, and louder than before. Russian was the language they were using, and their voices were frantic and scared. In their conversation, they were discussing an impending assault, a terrible occurrence, and something that had the potential to alter the path that history would take. We were unable to fathom what we were hearing, so we listened attentively in startled silence. Did these recordings come from transmissions in real time? Is it anything completely different? After then, there was a sudden cessation of the voices, which was followed by an eerie quiet. The power light on the transmitter fluctuated and eventually went off. The remaining areas of the outpost were explored, but we were unable to find anything that may provide an explanation for the voices, the signals, or the horrible feeling of desolation. We were able to collect residual communications from the Cold War, which were echoes of the past that were trapped in the ionosphere, according to the official explanation. But I am aware of the reality. Something occurred at the Echo-419 location, something that is not specifically mentioned in the official records. There is something that the administration would want to remain a secret. The recollection of that day continues to torment me. It was the deserted outpost, the apartments that had been kept, and the spectral voices that reverberated down the lonely halls. My goal is that I will never have to return to Echo 419, since it is a location where the past refuses to remain buried, where the stillness whispers secrets, and where I wish to never leave. Story 12. Even though it was the middle of the night, the massive and expansive complex that is Fort Hood in Texas was bustling with activity. It is 2023. During my time there, I was assigned to perform night shifts in the base operations center, where I was responsible for monitoring intelligence feeds and communication records. My name is Zephyr Zip Zane, and I have always described myself as a night owl who is most at ease in the peaceful stillness of the late hours of the night. On the other hand, the night during which the lights began to flicker was a night that I will never forget. The flickering of the fluorescent lights above was scarcely noticeable at first, but it was the beginning of something. I thought it was just a power spike, which is something that happens rather often on a site as huge as Fort Hood. Nevertheless, the flashing continued, which became more prominent and more rhythmic with time. It was not a random occurrence. There was a pattern to it. In the beginning, I was under the impression that I was imagining myself, that my mind was playing tricks on me in the stillness of the night. On the other hand, Sergeant Kenyon Ken Knight, a communications expert with years of experience, saw it as well. His eyes were wide with anxiety as he continued to glance at me. "Do you see that?" he said in a hushed voice. I gave a little nod, my heart beginning to beat rapidly in my chest. There was more to the flickering lights than simply a flickering. They were exchanging information. In a rhythm that seemed hauntingly similar, they were flashing in a succession of long and brief bursts throughout the whole sequence. The Morse code. A notebook and a pen were quickly grabbed by Ken, and he began hastily writing down the series of flashes. This caused his face to become pale as he interpreted the code. While he was looking at me, his voice was shaking. "I think we have a problem," he remarked. "Zip," and he was right. In a chillingly plain manner, the warning said, "Attack is imminent. The northern boundary, 0300 on the hour." One of the assaults on Fort Hood. At 3 o'clock in the morning, that may be reached in about 2 hours. Upon receiving the communication, we promptly informed our superiors, but they were doubtful of our claims. They said that we were suffering from exhaustion, stress, and hallucinating things, which led them to doubt our sanity. According to them, there was no genuine danger, and there was no information that suggested an assault was coming. Now, Ken and I were aware of what we had seen. We had seen the lights that were flashing, and we had figured out what the message was. We were aware that something was about to happen. We urged that they take the danger seriously, that they strengthen security, and that they notify the soldiers before they did anything else. It was a preventative measure, a means to pacify 2 overbearing night shift workers, and they grudgingly agreed to it. They dismissed it as a precautionary measure. Following that, we remained in a state of heightened alertness for the next 2 hours, keeping a close eye on the security cameras and waiting for anything to take place. As each minute passed, it seemed as if it had been going on for an eternity. The tension in the operations center was so intense that it could be felt and felt like it could be sliced with a knife. Then, at exactly 3 minutes past 3 o'clock, the alarms began to sound. Attempts had been made to breach the north boundary. The identity of the persons who were trying to penetrate the facility were unknown, and they presented themselves as armed. The chaos broke out. With sirens wailing and gunshots reverberating throughout the night, the troops hurriedly made their way to their posts. While Ken and I watched the unfolding of the events on the security cams, our hearts were hammering rapidly in our chests. Indeed, we had been wrong. Our attention was drawn to the flashing lights. We had been rescued by them. The assault was resisted, and the infiltrators were rendered ineffective. A cell of domestic terrorists was identified in the official report, although it is not clear what their motivations were. However, Ken and I were aware that the official narrative did not adequately convey the full extent of the events that transpired. There was no way that the flashing lights and the message in Morse code could have been a coincidence, since they were so accurate and detailed. There was never a public discussion regarding the lights that were flickering. For the sake of preserving the official story, we were instructed to remain silent. But I am aware of the reality. Someone or something had given us a formal warning. Fort Hood had been spared from a terrible assault by someone or something who had intervened. Which brings me to the issue that continues to torment me to this day. Who or what was it that was communicating with us? Story 13. In addition to the stifling humidity, the air was thick with the odor of salt and decay, and the continual drone of cicadas served as a soundtrack to the atmosphere. The year is 2024, Quantico, Virginia. I was working in the archives at the Marine Corps post where I was stationed, and I was surrounded by the dusty vestiges of history. To introduce myself, my name is Willow Whisper Whitman, and I have always been fascinated by the tales of those who served, the sacrifices they made, and the secrets they left behind. The mystery of the ghost dog tags, on the other hand, was a tale that refused to remain buried. A solitary dog tag was discovered stashed away in a box of old personnel papers, and this was the beginning of everything. Corporal Rhodes, Ranger Randall, a Marine who was reported as missing in action during the Vietnam War, was the owner of this item. I recognized his name from the Wall of Honor. Upon close inspection, I found that the tag's surface had become smooth due to the passage of time, and the writing was still readable. A Randall, RJ, United States Marine Corps. I made a note of the tag with the intention of adding it to the Maya database. The next day, however, a second dog tag was discovered. Private First Class Story Striker Stillman, who was also missing in action in Vietnam, was the owner of this particular one. This was followed by another, and then another, each of which belonged to a different Marine who had gone missing and appeared in a different part of the archives. The tags were usually discovered in unexpected locations, such as tucked into books, slid between papers, and even put on my desk as if by an individual who was not visible to me. It seemed as if they had recently been issued, since they were always spotless and polished. It was almost as if the specters of these American Marines who had gone missing were attempting to communicate with us in some way. When I began looking into the names that were written on the tags, I dug through the archives in an attempt to find any information that would shed light on what had happened to them. I was able to locate copies of their military records, letters to their families, and photos. I gained knowledge about their life, their aspirations, and the sacrifices they made. In addition, I was informed about the task that they were working on before they vanished. The operation known as Phantom Fury, a mission that was never officially recognized, despite the fact that it was highly secret and took place deep into enemy territory. In spite of the fact that the documents were few and largely censored, I was able to put together sufficient material to comprehend the magnitude of the operation, the dangers that were involved, and the terrible effects that it had. There was no success in the mission. Every member of the crew was never found, and their remains were never found. It was stated in the official report that the adversary had taken action, but the specifics were hazy and almost intentionally disguised. There were suspicions, whispers, and speculations that something more sinister was going on, that there was a cover-up. As I dug more into the mystery, the phantom dog tags began to materialize. Each one was a quiet monument to the Marines who had vanished, and it served as a haunting reminder of the questions that remained unresolved about their disappearance. As time went on, I became more aware of my obligation to seek the truth and provide closure to the families of these brave individuals who had lost their lives. I eventually located it, a solitary document that has not been censored and is concealed deep inside a classified file. In the document, which was written by a high-ranking officer, the actual nature of Operation Phantom Fury was described in great detail. Not at all was it a mission of reconnaissance. There was an effort to kill the individual, an unsuccessful endeavor. A high-ranking North Vietnamese officer who played a pivotal role in the adversary's war effort was the target of the operations. In the process of ambushing the crew, the operation was compromised, and their remains were left behind in the woods. As a result of the government's concern of the political repercussions, the operation was misrepresented, all documents were classified, and everyone who knew the truth was silenced. There was a message included inside the phantom dog tags. There is a message from the spirits of those Marines who have gone missing, a message that demands justice, and a message that demands that the truth be presented. I brought the paper to my bosses, presented them with the proof, and insisted that the truth be disclosed to them. They were apprehensive, hesitant to reveal the falsehoods spoken by the administration, and they were unwilling to rehash old wounds. But despite this, I continued because I felt a sense of responsibility. and a desire to pay tribute to the memories of those warriors who had died. It was ultimately decided to declassify the narrative of Operation Phantom Fury, and the truth was made public to the whole globe. At long last, the families of the Marines who went missing were able to find closure, and their loved ones were finally acknowledged for the sacrifice they made. The appearance of the phantom dog tags came to an end. The delivery of their message had taken place. Their objective had been accomplished. Story 14. The Amazon rainforest was a dense jungle that closed in on us like a wall of green that was stifling. The air was heavy with humidity, and the buzzing of insects could be heard throughout the jungle. 2025 Brazil during the time. We were a part of a coordinated operation with Brazilian special forces that was aimed at tracking down a gang of highly equipped narco-terrorists who were operating close to the border with Peru. My name is Asher Shadowslate, and since I have always been comfortable in the shadows, I have always been able to blend into the background and observe without being seen. On the other hand, the shadows in the Amazon contained something that was more than simply blackness. We were kept captive by them. At that moment, we were deep into the bush, creeping stealthily through the vegetation while keeping our senses ready for anything. Our objective was to track down and eliminate the narco-terrorists, a gang that is notorious for its cruelty and their in-depth familiarity with the landscape through which they operate. Over the course of many days, we had been following their slender path through the thick undergrowth in order to locate them. Then, we became aware of them. There are shadows, moving just beyond the edge of our field of view, imitating our motions and performing patterns that are identical to ours. At first, we thought they were just tricks of the light, illusions that were produced by the dappled sunshine that was passing through the thick canopy. On the other hand, the shadows continued to exist, becoming more distinct and solid. They had a humanoid appearance, were black and imperceptible, yet there was no denying their presence. They glided through the foliage with an incredible ease, without making a sound as they carried out their movements. It seemed as if they were playing a game of cat and mouse with us, since they were constantly just out of reach, just beyond the edge of our peripheral vision. Despite our best efforts to ignore them and concentrate on our task, the shadows remained a continuous presence, serving as a persistent reminder that we were not an isolated group. There was a watchful eye on us, looking inside us. Our single action is being learned. During his first deployment, Private Leighton Leo Langley, a young recruit, began to experience a gradual decline in his behavior. He said that the shadows were communicating with him in a whisper, conveying information to him that no one else could hear. He said that they were addressing him by name and urging him to come into the shadows along with them. Even though we made an effort to soothe him and tell him that he was only seeing things, the shadows were beginning to have an effect on all of us. As a result of the persistent monitoring, we were jittery and anxious, and our nerves got strained. We began to see things, hear things, and experience things that were not really present. On the other hand, our squad leader, Sergeant Magnolia Maggie Mayhew, uncovered a finding that was quite unsettling. In the vicinity of the foot of a massive kapok tree, she discovered a set of dog tags that were partially buried in the mud. The tags belonged to a member of a Special Forces squad that had vanished in the same exact location 5 years prior to the discovery of the tags. An organization that has been following the same gang of drug traffickers and terrorists. Everything, including the documents and the mission logs, was examined by us. There were reports that the squad that had gone missing had seen the same shadows, the same motions that mimicked others, and the same murmurs in the darkness. They had the impression that they were being watched, followed, and pursued. Then, without a trace, they had disappeared without a trace. After that, we came to the conclusion that the shadows were not only illusions. The things they were genuine, something that is malicious, something that has been ominous in this section of the bush for a considerable amount of time, something that exploited anxieties, paranoia, and the vulnerability of the human psyche in order to gain success. Changes were made to our strategy, and we shifted away from stealth and toward assault. As we made our way into the bush, we kept our rifles high and scanned the shadows, demanding that they reveal themselves. We proceeded further into their domain, resolute in our intention to face them and reveal the actual essence of their character. Then we were able to locate them. Indeed, it is not the shadows themselves, but rather their origin, an undiscovered cavern that is located deep into the jungle's interior. The remnants of the Special Forces squad that had gone missing were discovered within the cave. Their corpses were bones, and their equipment was dispersed around the cave. Moreover, we discovered something else, something that may have shed light on the darkness, a particular kind of bioluminescent fungus that is growing on the cave walls and emits a light that is dim and pulses. It was the presence of live creatures, as well as movement and sound, that prompted the fungus to respond. It created the sense of being watched, followed, or stalked by projecting shadows that mimicked whatever motions that were being made. The fungus served as a natural defensive system with the purpose of protecting the cave and discouraging others from entering there. On the other hand, it had also turned into a trap and a lure, luring victims who were unaware of its danger into its embrace. The members of the Special Forces squad that had gone missing had succumbed to the psychological effects of the fungus. Their brains had been devastated by the continual observation, and their bodies had been abandoned to decay in the shadows. In order to rid the cave of the fungus's malicious influence, we killed it by setting it ablaze using grenades that were designed to ignite fire. There were no longer any shadows. The whispering came to an end. There was complete silence in the bush. Bringing some sort of order to the mayhem, we were successful in completing our task, which consisted of neutralizing the narco-terrorists. On the other hand, the recollection of the Shadow Squad, which serves as a disturbing reminder of the power of illusion and the vulnerability of the human mind, continues to disturb me to this day. Story 15. A shimmering river of light in the pitch blackness of the night sky, the Milky Way was a huge expanse of star-studded sky that spread out above us. In the year 2026, White Sands Missile Range is located in New Mexico. Our position was to keep an eye on a number of high-altitude tests while we were stationed at a distant observation point. My name is Ephraim Zep Zenith, and I have always been captivated by the expanse of space and the secrets that are concealed beyond the confines of our globe. Nevertheless, the sound vanished throughout the night. The night in question was one that brought me to the very brink of reality. On that night, the desert air was crisp and silent, and the sky was clear and frigid. Inside the observation station, we were transfixed to the monitors, watching the trajectory of the test missile as it flew into the high sky. Our eyes were drawn to the displays. After then it took place. It was no longer audible. Not just the sound of the missile, but every sound in their entirety. There was no longer any sound other than the buzz of the generators, the spinning of the cooling fans, and even our own breathing. The whole globe was thrown into a complete and utter hush that was unsettling. Both of our cheeks were pale, and our eyes were wide with surprise as we gave each other a glance. We attempted to communicate, but there was no sound that came out of our mouths. We were able to see the movement of our lips and the vibration of our voice cords, but there was no sound. At that moment, it seemed as if we were ensnared in a void, a silent film being acted out against the background of the night sky studded with stars. After that, we found them, quantities, making their way around the property in complete silence. Their silhouettes seemed black and vague against the dim light emanating from the monitors. The form of their bodies was similar to that of humans, but their motions were strange. As they moved over the ground, it seemed as if their feet were not making contact with the surface, and their bodies contorted into angles that seem inconceivable. We made an effort to communicate with one another by pointing, signaling, and gesturing, but the figures seemed to be unaware of our existence. As they proceeded around the property, their motions were completely quiet, which served as a disturbing contrast to the complete stillness that filled the area around us. A veteran with steel nerves, Sergeant Oberon Obi Oaks, lunged for his weapon. He was a veteran. His eyes were locked on the person who was closest to him as he walked slowly and methodically. He did so, raising his weapon and aiming it at the head of the person. The trigger was pulled by him. Make a click. There was a reverberation throughout the observation post caused by the sound of the firing pin hitting the empty chamber. There was a break in the quiet. None of the figures were seen, not in any other way. It's gone. The sound started to come back and it flooded back into the universe. It was the buzz of the generators, the spinning of the fans, and our own frenzied breathing. Both of our faces were pale, and our bodies were shaking as we gazed at each other. What had we just seen and experienced? Have they been real? On the other hand, were these only hallucinations, the creations of our own brains that were heightened by the abrupt quiet that defied explanation? During our investigation, we replay the tape from the security cameras to the precise instant when the noises stopped. Nothing could be seen in the clip. Only the vacant enclosure, illuminated by the dim light of the security lights, was visible. There were no people or any activity in the area. There was no evidence that the figurines had ever been present. A momentary fault in the audio monitoring equipment, sometimes known as a glitch in the system, was the official reason for the incident which occurred. However, I am aware of what I saw. I heard the sound of the firing pin clicking against the barrel of the rifle. I saw individuals moving stealthily around the complex, and I saw Obi lift his weapon. The stillness was genuine, as far as I am aware. In addition, I am aware that the statistics, regardless of what they were also genuine. The recollection of that evening continues to torment me. The complete absence of sound, the spectral forms, and the terrifying knowledge that we were not alone, that something else was sharing our reality, something that crept stealthily in the shadows, something that could erase sound, something that might delete. Us were all elements that contributed to the unsettling experience. Story 16. The sun was blazing down on the dusty streets of Baghdad, and the oppressive heat was hanging thick in the air for a long time. In the year 2027, Iraq. While I was stationed there, I worked as a logistics officer, which meant that I was responsible for managing the transfer of soldiers and goods. I have always been a stickler for rules, for following instructions, and for keeping order amid the chaos of battle. My name is Xander X. Xavier, and I have always been a stickler for that. However, the instructions that I discovered on that particular day were orders from a battle that had been forgotten, orders that would eventually lead me to a reality that had been buried for many years. I was going through a stack of old paperwork, which were dusty remains of earlier deployments, when I came upon an envelope that had been sealed. Someone named Captain Wallace Wally Weston, whose name I was unfamiliar with, was the recipient of the letter. Age had caused the envelope to become yellow, the writing to fade, and the return address was a military base that had been disbanded for a long time. After my curiosity was awakened, I opened the packet with great care. During the First Gulf War, I discovered a set of instructions that were dated 1991 and were located within. A secret mission, a reconnaissance operation deep behind enemy lines, was described in full in the order's instructions. The purpose of the operation was very clear: to find and retrieve a pilot who had been shot down. The mission was secret, and the facts were carefully suppressed. Lieutenant Thaddeus Tad Thorne, a rookie F-16 pilot, was the pilot who was shot down during a bombing operation. His name was Lieutenant Thorne. He was thought to be dead with the status of missing in action. Lieutenant Thorne was to be located and brought back, either dead or alive. According to the instructions that were given to Captain Weston, who was to lead a small squad into enemy territory. It piqued my interest. After all these years, why were these orders still present in this location? The question is, why hadn't they been preserved, filed away, or destroyed? I was overcome with an odd need to acquire further knowledge, to trace the path of these forgotten directives, and to discover the destination that they went to. I began my investigation of Captain Weston and Lieutenant Thorne by going through the archives for any material that could be relevant to their objective. A picture of Captain Weston, as well as his service record and commendations, were discovered by me. He was a gentleman who had devoted his whole life to serving his nation, and he was a highly decorated soldier, as well as a recognized leader. Afterwards, I discovered the account of his casualty. In 1991, he was killed in combat, a year that coincides with the commands. I discovered the file of Lieutenant Thorne, as well as his flight records and messages to his family. He was a young guy who was brimming with vitality and had a promising career in front of him. I then discovered that he was missing in action, bringing the excruciating uncertainty that had been plaguing his family for decades to an end. I was experiencing a rising feeling of duty, as well as the urge to complete what Captain Weston had begun, in order to provide Lieutenant Thorne's family with a sense of resolution. Despite my request to be granted access to the secret files that were associated with the operation, I was not granted access. The material was deemed to be too sensitive, and it was explained to me that rehashing old wounds would serve no constructive purpose. But I did not give up. After making contact with Lieutenant Thorne's family, I informed them of what I had discovered and offered to assist them in finding answers. They were thankful and anxious for any information that may relate to their kid who had gone missing. The encouragement I received from them gave me the fortitude to keep going, to fight against the opposition from the bureaucracy, and to demand access to the truth. My persistent efforts over the course of many months finally paid off, and I was allowed access to the confidential papers. When the papers were examined, the truth about the mission, the ambush, and the arrest of Lieutenant Thorne was revealed. They disclosed the site of his improvised cemetery, which was a solitary area in the desert of Iraq that seemed to have been forgotten and unregistered. A recovery expedition, consisting of a small squad of troops, was planned by me with the objective of bringing Lieutenant Thorne back home. Our journey took us to the predetermined place, where the desert lay out in front of us, huge and devoid of any inhabitants. We discovered the burial, which was a small hole in the sand, and was only marked by a few stones that were thrown about. We exhumed the remains with great care, treating them with the respect and dignity that they deserved before we did so. It was determined without a reasonable doubt that they were Lieutenant Thorne when we took them back to the base facility. His relatives were informed, and the wait that had lasted for decades was finally ended. A fact that had been hidden for an excessively long time was revealed to me as a result of the forgotten directives. They had brought me to a lifeless hero, a son who had been forgotten, and a family that had at long last received the resolution they deserved. As a result of their influence, I gained a more profound comprehension of the price that war exacts, the sacrifices that are made, and the tales that must never be forgotten. Story 17. The smell of dust and mildew hung heavily in the air, and the ancient wooden barracks creaked and moaned beneath the weight of the number of years that had passed. The year is 2028, Fort Riley, Kansas. At the time, I was stationed there, participating in advanced training and sharing a tiny room with 3 other troops. I have always been sensitive to noises, to the subtleties of the acoustic environment. My name is Yasmin Yaz Yarrow, and I have always been sensitive to sounds. On the other hand, the noises that I heard in those barracks were like reverberations from the past, like whispers from times gone by. It began in a barely audible manner, with a few snippets of discussion and weak whispers that floated through the walls. In the beginning, I thought that these were the noises of other troops in the quarters that were next to mine, and that their voices were being muted by the thin walls. Nevertheless, the voices were distinct. Their voice was dated, antiquated, as if it was something taken from a documentary about the past. As they became more audible, the murmurs transformed into distinct voices that were distinct and resonant, and they reverberated down the empty halls. The voices of the guys were infused with a peculiar blend of terror and companionship, and I could hear them conversing, joking, and disputing with one another. A variety of noises could be heard, including the clattering of metal, the rustling of paper, and the sound of boots on hardwood flooring. It was the sound of a guy yelling that roused me from my sleep one night. Although his voice was harsh and forceful, the words he was saying were concise and precise. He was giving commands. "Pay notice, companies. Get yourself ready to go. Is it double time?" I was so startled by the voice that I immediately sprang out of bed and grabbed my belongings, anticipating that I would find a drill sergeant waiting in the doorway. The voice was so loud and so genuine. Nevertheless, there was no one present. There was no one inside the barracks, and the only sound that could be heard was the faint brightness of the moonlight that was coming in through the dirty windows. As I glanced at my roommates, I saw that their features were pale and their eyes were wide with fright. In addition, they had heard it. The reverberating voices became a nightly occurrence, and they filled the barracks with the sounds of a time that had long since passed. We listened to talks about wars, about training exercises, and about the seemingly insignificant aspects of life in the army. Songs, jokes, tales, and mutterings of terror, and a desire to return home were all heard by us. We began our investigation into the history of the barracks by combing through the archives and looking for any insight that would provide a hint as to the origin of the voices that were heard repeating. It was revealed to us that the barracks had been constructed during World War II and had been used to house troops who were getting ready to be sent to Europe. We were shown information on the troops that had remained there, the conflicts that they had fought, and the sacrifices that they had made. We were able to locate it. One of the vacant rooms has a concealed chamber that is concealed by a floorboard that is not securely fastened. When we opened the pocket, we discovered a little diary that was bound in leather. A soldier by the name of Private Everett Ev Eastwood, who was a member of the 101 Stones Airborne Division and was stationed at Fort Riley in 1944, was the owner of the diary. During his time at Fort Riley, Ev kept a notebook in which he detailed his experiences, including his training, his friendships, and his anxieties over the war. The friendship that existed inside the barracks, the late-night chats, and the shared fears for the future that was uncertain were all topics that he wrote about. It was in his writing that he expressed his aspirations and desires, his affection for his family, and his steadfast faith in the cause for which he was fighting. Then he wrote about the accident that had occurred, a training exercise that went horribly wrong, a sad catastrophe that resulted in the deaths of numerous troops, including EV himself. The last note in the diary was a chillingly short statement, and it read, "The silence is deafening." When we finally understood what was going on, we recognized that the voices that were resonating were those of Eve and his fellow soldiers. Their recollections were etched into the very fabric of the barracks, and their tales continued to reverberate through the years. They were not ghosts, nor were they evil spirits. Rather, they were echoes of the past, reminders of the sacrifices that were made, the lives that were lost, and the tales that must never be remembered. We shared the notebook with the historian of the base, who was very impacted by Ev's narrative while reading it. A monument to the troops who had trained at Fort Riley, who had lived and died inside those echoing barracks. The diary was added to the archives of the military installation. A solemn respect and a feeling of being connected to the past eventually took the place of the voices as they progressively faded away. We had spent time listening to their experiences and paying tribute to their memories, and as a result, we had brought them moments of serenity. Story 18. My cheeks were bitten by the brisk, icy air, and the snow crunched beneath my boots as I made my way through the unspoiled countryside. It is the year 2029 at Camp Hale, Colorado. The camp was a training site for troops who were prepared for cold weather battle. It was located high in the Rocky Mountains, tucked amid the towering peaks. My name is Indy Iverson, and I have always been attracted to the mountains, not just because of the seclusion that they provide, but also because of the difficulty that they provide. Nevertheless, the winter in which we found the footprints that disappeared, it was a winter that put my sanity to the test to its absolute maximum. It all began with a regular patrol, during which a small group of us were assigned with reconnaissance of the terrain in the surrounding area. Overnight, there was a significant amount of snowfall, which resulted in the countryside being completely covered in a perfect white quiet. While we were making our way through the snow-covered woodland, we were aware of something peculiar. There are footprints. There was only one pair of footsteps, and they led away from the camp and disappeared into the great desert. Despite the fact that the snow had not yet been disturbed, the tracks were still fresh. These tracks were unlike any others that we had ever seen before. The stride was strange, and they were enormous, nearly to the point of being impossible to imagine. Steps that were long and deliberate, as if the person who made them was gliding over the snow with their feet barely brushing the surface of the snow. As we followed the footsteps, our interests were aroused, and our concern increased with each step that we took. We were led further into the bush by the tracks, away from the routes that we were acquainted with, and into a valley that was unexplored and desolate. The valley was devoid of sound and emptiness, and the atmosphere was thick with a definite sensation of loneliness. Subsequently, the tracks disappeared. Not in any other way. It's gone. It is as if the individual who was responsible for making them had suddenly vanished into thin air. There was no indication that they were there, despite the fact that we searched all about and scanned the snow-covered countryside. The absence of any additional footprints, tracks, or other indications of their whereabouts was present. As we made our way back to the camp, our brains were filled with questions, and our disquiet was gradually transforming into a gnawing sensation of suspense. Despite the fact that we informed our superiors about our finding, they rejected it as a joke or a hoax created by a few bored recruits. They advised us to put it out of our minds and concentrate on our training instead, but we were unable to ignore it. A disturbing reminder that something unknown was lurking in the bush, something that walked quietly through the snow, something that eluded explanation. The disappearing tracks had made an impression on us. They had left a mark on us via their disappearance. Repeatedly, the footprints were found the next day. A new pair of footsteps. These footprints were similar to the previous set of footprints. They led away from the camp and disappeared into the same lonely valley. The combination of curiosity and dread served as the driving force behind our resolve to continue following them. On this occasion, we were well prepared. With the intention of demonstrating that we were not dreaming things, we took cameras, GPS trackers, and anything else that may assist us in documenting our discoveries. The footsteps led us to the same location where they had disappeared the day before, and we followed them there. Our eyes scanned every inch of the snow-covered ground as we scoured the area with great care and attention to detail. After that, we were able to locate it, a little container made of metal that was partially buried in the snow. We proceeded with caution to remove the canister, which had a surface that was icy and silky to the touch. We did so with our hearts thumping in our chests as we opened it. Upon inspection, we discovered a roll of film, which was a form of film that is no longer manufactured. It was a remnant from a bygone period. During the process of developing the film, our excitement gradually transformed into a terrifying reality. There were a number of grainy and black and white images included in the movie. These photographs showed a group of troops who were clothed in antiquated winter garb, and their features were veiled by shadows all around them. The equipment that they were carrying was peculiar, and it was stuff that we had never seen before. In addition, there is a big metallic thing that is rising over them in the backdrop, and its form is strange, cannot be identified. A shimmering gateway, a whirling vortex of light and snow, was shown in the last shot of the series, which showed the troops vanishing into the portal. Following the disappearance of the gateway, the only thing that remained was the snow-covered valley. After that, we came to the conclusion that the disappearing footsteps were more than simply footprints. Their presence served as a doorway, a portal to a different era and a different dimension. The army personnel shown in the images did not exist during our era. They were visitors from another universe who temporarily intersected with our own. They were from the past or possibly the future. They were presented with the images, the film canister, and the indisputable proof of something that was beyond our understanding. We reported our findings to our superiors and presented them with the evidence. In spite of their skepticism and lack of belief, they were unable to disagree with the facts. They conducted a comprehensive inquiry, but over the course of the investigation, they could not find any answers. The disappearing footsteps remained a mystery, serving as a disturbing reminder of the unknowable that lies just beyond the curtain of reality. Story 19. There was a steady soundtrack of the persistent yelling, which was accompanied by the rhythmic thud of boots on asphalt. The air was heavy with the smell of perspiration and despair. In the year 2030, Parris Island, South Carolina, Marine Corps recruit training is a location where young men and women are shaped into warriors. It is a place that serves as a formative environment. My name is Kieran Kip Kelly, and I was there, suffering the arduous challenges and pushing myself to the boundaries of my physical and mental endurance. I was there through it all. On the other hand, the summer in which we came face to face with the spectral drill sergeant was a summer that completely drove us past the boundaries of our sanity. First, there were rumors and murmurs that were going around among the recruits. These were stories about a drill sergeant who had passed away many years before, and his ghost was still said to be haunting the training grounds. It was stated that he made his appearance throughout the night, with his spectral shape following the barracks and his voice from another world reverberating through the hallways. According to what they stated, he was searching for something that he had misplaced, something that he needed in order to finish his task. When we initially heard the reports, we thought they were nothing more than hearsay. There are tales that are intended to terrify the new recruits and to test their determination. Following that, however, we began to see him. During the night, he made his appearance as a shadowy figure in the faint light of the barracks. His body was towering and intimidating, and his face was concealed by the darkness. His clothing was faded and tattered, giving the impression that it had been buried for years and had just lately been uncovered. He wore a drill instructor's hat in the traditional way, with the brim drawn low over his eyes. Despite the fact that he did not talk, his presence was unsettling. There was a real feeling of fear, and there was a terrifying atmosphere of power that was loud enough to hush even the most exuberant recruits. After appearing for a little period of time, he would go, leaving behind a lingering sensation of disquiet. We had the impression that we were being observed, analyzed, and judged by a force that we could not see. Afterward, the events began to occur. The equipment failed, there were accidents during training, and there were bizarre happenings that could not be explained. The misfiring of a weapon during a live fire drill, the collapse of a recruit during a forced march, and the disappearance of a training handbook without a trace are all cases that have occurred. There seemed to be a connection between each occurrence and the spectral drill sergeant, as if he was exerting some kind of influence on the happenings, manipulating the surroundings and testing our boundaries. Attributing the occurrences to stress, tiredness, and the strain of recruit training, Sergeant Brennan "Brick" Buckley, our senior drill instructor, a hardened veteran with a no-nonsense approach, denied the rumors. He said that the incidents were caused by recruitment training. However, even he was unable to ignore the rising feeling of disquiet and the tangible dread that was spreading across the ranks of the organization. I eventually located it, the instruction handbook that is missing. Hidden behind a heap of worn-out uniforms, it was stashed away in a dusty corner of the attic where it had been discovered. The handbook was published in 1950, and its pages were yellowed and fragile. The contents of the manual were unsettling. In the handbook, a number of experimental training tactics and psychological conditioning procedures were described in detail. These methods were aimed to drive recruits to their breaking point in order to produce warriors who were not only physically strong, but also psychologically tough, capable of surviving atrocities that were beyond their human comprehension. The methods were cruel, barbaric, and on the verge of being tantamount to torture. Due to the fact that they were thought to be much too risky and contentious, they were ultimately prohibited. It was the spectral drill sergeant. The instruction manual had been written by him, the author. It was him who had been the one to design these respective methods. The handbook was not something he intended to use, rather, he was hunting for it with the intention of destroying it, erasing all trace of his history and making up for the harm he had caused. Sergeant Buckley was the recipient of the handbook, and I proceeded to describe what I had discovered, including the link to the spectral drill sergeant and the rationale for the weird happenings. At first he was suspicious, but he discovered that he was unable to ignore the facts. He made touch with his superiors, informed them of the finding, and asked and received direction. It was determined that the contents of the handbook should be classified. The spectral drill sergeant vanished without a trace. The supernatural happenings came to an end. However, with a refreshed sense of purpose, a more profound understanding of the sacrifices that were made, the lessons that were learned, and the ghosts of the past that continued to lurk in the shadows, the training proceeded uninterrupted. Story 20. A rhythmic reminder of the great strength that nature has, the waves breaking on the hull of our ship served as a visual representation of the vastness and desolateness of the Pacific Ocean that spread out before us. In the year 2031, the USS Nimitz. I was working as a communications officer, which meant that I was responsible for monitoring radio traffic and keeping in touch with other ships and shore stations. The unseen world of radio waves, the voices and data that pass through the air, and the manner in which they link us to the world beyond the horizon, have always been something that has captivated me. My name is Lysander Lake. On the other hand, the signal that we were able to intercept that evening was a signal that extended beyond our comprehension, starting off as a low-frequency drone that barely recorded on our sensors. It was a faint hum that we could hear. Our first reaction was to dismiss it as air interference, which is a phenomenon that often occurs in the wide length of the Pacific Ocean. Despite this, the hum continued to intensify and become more distinct, eventually transforming into a sequence of pulses that followed a rhythmic pattern that failed to be explained. After doing an analysis of the signal, we attempted to determine its origin, its frequency, and its function. It contrasted with everything else that we had previously experienced. Not only was it not Morse code, but it was also not any recognized kind of encryption, and it was not even known as human language. A different thing was happening. A succession of intricate pulses, a rhythmic pattern that appeared to vibrate deep inside our consciousness, was the signal that repeated itself over and over again. The experience was captivating and nearly mesmerizing. It was as if we were pulled to it, compelled to listen to it, and forced to figure out what its secret message was. The signal then underwent a shift. As time went on, The pulses got more intricate and organized, resulting in the formation of a series of different patterns and sequences that apparently represented something. During that moment, we came to the realization that the signal was carrying data, which is a sort of information. What type of information is it, though? And who is it that comes from? For the purpose of analyzing the signal and breaking its coding, we used our most advanced decryption software as well as our most computationally capable processors. In the end, we were successful in decoding a tiny piece of the data after putting in a lot of hard work for many hours. On Earth, it was a place that corresponded to a set of coordinates. The place, on the other hand, did not exist. There was a large stretch of empty sea in the midst of the Pacific Ocean, hundreds of miles away from any known continent, and the coordinates led to a location in center of the ocean. Both our charts and our maps, as well as our satellite images, were examined. One could not find anything there. There are no islands, reefs, or mountains that are underwater. It's just water. Our superiors were informed of our discoveries, and we presented them with the decoded coordinates, the analysis of the signal, and the proof that cannot be refuted that something unknown was there. In spite of their skepticism and lack of belief, they were unable to disagree with the facts. We were given the order to conduct an investigation, and we were to dispatch a reconnaissance team to the selected area in order to find out what was there. We deployed a helicopter to the stated locations, which was outfitted with sonar and other cutting-edge detecting technology. After flying for a considerable amount of time, the chopper scanned the water below, looking for any indication of land, any abnormality, or anything else that would provide an explanation for the unusual signal. And then they discovered it. Rather of being land, an island, or a reef, it is something else entirely. There was a shimmering distortion in the water, a spinning vortex of light and energy, and it seemed as if the very fabric of existence was unraveling. A mixture of amazement and anxiety could be heard in the voices of the crew of the chopper as they relayed their findings. The distortion, the energy that was flowing about, and the feeling of otherness were all reported by them. They described it as if they were staring into another dimension, as if they were peering through a portal to another location. We issued an order for them to return to the ship so that they could personally report their findings. However, as soon as they turned around, the distortion disappeared. The turbulent energy evaporated and the water became quiet, as if it had never been there in the first place. After what they had seen, the crew of the chopper was disturbed, and their brains were spinning as they made their way back to the parent ship. The mystery signal continued to transmit, and the pulsating rhythms of its transmission reverberated over the vastness of the Pacific Ocean. We continued to keep an eye on it, to investigate it, and to make an effort to comprehend its function, its genesis, and its significance. However, the signal continued to be a mystery, a disturbing reminder of the unknown that lurks just outside the curtain of reality. It was a signal from a location that does not exist, a signal from someplace else. Story 21. The sound of the wind howling over the bleak terrain and whistling through the shattered windows of the abandoned farmhouse was a sorrowful sound that matched the forlorn nature of the environment. In the year 2032, somewhere in the agricultural parts of Nebraska, following a series of severe storms that slammed across the area, we were a member of a National Guard unit that had been mobilized to help with disaster recovery efforts by the government. My name is Morgan Mo Miller, and I have seen my fair share of devastation, which is the unbridled force of nature that has been released onto the world that is unaware of its existence. However, what we discovered in that area was a different type of destruction than what we had anticipated, a catastrophe that could not be explained in any way. The moment we discovered it, we began cleaning up the rubble and looking for those who had survived. It is a tank, An M4 Sherman tank from World War II was found sitting in the midst of a field, and it seemed to have been unaffected by the tornadoes that had destroyed everything in its immediate vicinity. It seemed as if it had just materialized at that location. Although the paint on the tank had faded, it was still intact, and the tracks had corroded but were still working. The tank was in remarkable, excellent shape. Even though it seemed to be stuck in mid-salute, the main cannon was aimed upwards into the sky. No evidence of its crew could be found. There were no remains, no personal items, and no clues as to what had happened to them and their whereabouts. Our guns were elevated, and our senses were on high alert as we approached the tank with considerable caution. We drove around the truck, inspecting it from every conceivable aspect, looking for any indication that may shed light on its history, its function, and the reason for its unexpected emergence in the midst of a cornfield in Nebraska. The hatch had been shut and secured when seen from the inside. We attempted to pry it open, but it refused to move from its position, almost as if the tank itself was putting up a fight against us. We requested the assistance of a specialized group from a neighboring military installation, which was armed with cutting torches and other heavy-duty instruments with us. They were successful in cutting through the hatch, which allowed them to see the inside of the tank. The inside was spotless, almost as if it had never been touched. The controls were still in their original places. The chairs would still be modified to accommodate the crew, and the radio would continue to be set to a frequency that had not been used for decades. Nobody seemed to be struggling. There was no damage, and there was no indication of what had occurred to the crew. Quite simply, they had disappeared. We examined the surrounding area, including the field, the farmhouse, and the woods that were close by, but we were unable to locate any evidence of the team, any personal things, or any ideas about what happened to them. It seemed as if they had all of a sudden ceased to exist. In an effort to get the tank back to the base for additional inspection, we attempted to start it, move it, and bring it back. On the other hand, the tank did not comply. Not only did the engine refuse to turn over, but the rails also refused to move, and the controls were unresponsive. It seemed as if the tank was moored to that location, unable to move from its current position. A team of mechanics, engineers, and specialists in military vehicles from the time of World War II was brought in. They performed diagnostics on the tank, inspected it, and did everything they could think of, but unfortunately they were unable to get it to start. They said that the engine was in excellent functioning condition, the mechanics were in good working order, and the electronics were operational. There was no rational explanation whatsoever for why the tank would not start. After that, one of the mechanics, a grizzled old veteran by the name of Sergeant Major Reginald Reg Riley, became aware of something. Hidden behind the driver's seat is a little metal box that has been hidden away. Despite the fact that the box was locked, Reg was able to pick the lock and access the contents of the box. We only discovered one thing inside the box, and that was a picture. An image of the crew of the tank, which was taken in black and white and has since faded, depicts 4 young men dressed in World War II uniforms. Their faces are beaming, and their eyes are filled with optimism and resolve. The following inscription was scrawled and placed on the reverse side of the photograph: "Our last stand, May 12, 1945. All of the historical documents, the war logs, and everything else were examined by us. This is the 12th of May. Europe was experiencing the last days of World War II. A reconnaissance unit had been operating behind enemy lines, and the crew of the tank had been a member of that outfit. The German force that they had faced was superior, and they had been cornered, outnumbered, and outgunned. While they were battling to the death, they had made their final stand, but their sacrifice had gone unnoticed, and their narrative had been lost. The tank that had been abandoned in the cornfield in Nebraska. More than simply a tank, it was a testament to the courage and sacrifice of 4 young men who had sacrificed their lives for their nation. It was a time capsule that had been preserved for future generations. Not only was it a terrible reminder of the atrocities of war, but it was also a ghost of the past, a reminder of the tales that must never be forgotten. It was a quiet testimony to the heroes of a conflict that had been forgotten, and we left the tank where it was situated. We made sure that their narrative would be conveyed and that their sacrifice would be remembered by marking the place, notifying the local historical organization, and coordinating our efforts. It was a reminder that even in the face of disaster, hope and bravery can persist. The tank stayed in the field, acting as a ghostly sentry, preserving the memory of its crew. Story 22. The antiseptic linoleum floor was covered in lengthy, twisted shadows that were formed by the flickering fluorescent lights that were buzzing above. The Naval Air Station in Pensacola, Florida, in the year 3000. I was stationed there and working as a photographer, recording the everyday lives of the pilots and crew. I was able to capture the moments of success and camaraderie that are characteristic of military duty. I have always seen the world through the lens of my camera, catching the fleeting moments, keeping the memories, and conveying the tales that would otherwise be lost to time. My name is Phoenix Finn Flynn, and I have always seen the world through the lens of my camera. However, the photograph that I shot on that particular day was one that conveyed a narrative that I had not anticipated. A group of young Navy aviators were receiving their wings as part of a graduation ceremony. Their faces were gleaming with joy as they got their licenses. I was there and able to capture the moment, which was the result of years of laborious effort, unwavering commitment, and self-reliance. In addition to framing the photo, I positioned the grads, made adjustments to the lighting, and then hit the shutter release button. In order to preserve the memories for future generations, the flash lighted the scene, which resulted in the moment being frozen in time. In the latter part of that day, while I was back in the lab developing the film, I became aware of something that was uncomfortable. It is a shadow. In the backdrop of the photograph, right behind the graduating class, there is a shadowy person that is difficult to make out. It was a tall, thin figure that seemed almost spectral-like. In spite of the fact that its characteristics were concealed by the shadows, its existence could not be denied. When I looked at the negative, I looked for any defects or blemishes that may be the cause of the shadow. However, the negative was spotless and unblemished, and the shadow was plainly perceptible. In an effort to bring the figure into greater focus, I reproduced the photograph and made adjustments to the contrast, brightness, and exposure settings simultaneously. However, the shadow continued to evade capture, a mysterious mystery that lingered on the periphery of the frame. I displayed the photograph to my co-workers and inquired as to whether or not they were familiar with the individual shown on it, as well as whether or not they had seen it during the graduation ceremony. On the other hand, nobody had. Not a single person could recall ever having seen somebody standing in that particular location, and none could explain why the shadow was seen in the photograph. I began to get obsessed with the photograph, magnifying it, analyzing it, and examining each and every feature in an effort to discover any information that would shed light on the identity of the dark person. I was persuaded that it was more than simply a photographic aberration or a trick of the light. I started to believe that it was more than that. As time went on, I became more uneasy, and I got the impression that I had recorded something that was unearthly. I eventually located it. A dusty nook of the archives has an old yearbook that has been stashed away forever. A quarter of a century earlier, in 1988, the yearbook was released to the public. I was looking for something as I flicked through the pages of the book, looking at the photographs of previous graduating classes, and then I came upon him. There was a young naval aviator with a smile on his face and eyes that were filled with hope and promise. His stance, his form, and his height were all similar to the shadowy figure that I had captured in my photograph. He was standing in the same position. Under the photograph, I read the caption, which stated, "Lieutenant Jasper Jensen, sometimes known as Jax, his class is at the top. 1989, when they were killed in a training accident." At that moment, I became aware that the shadow in my photograph was more than simply a shadow. A ghost was present. This is the spirit of Lieutenant Jensen, who is making his way back to the location where he had accomplished his goals and where his life was sadly cut short. His presence was felt as a quiet guardian, a ghostly reminder of the sacrifices that were made, the aspirations that were postponed, and the lives that were lost in the quest of duty and honor. He was there, looking over the newly graduated students. The family of Lieutenant Jensen was shown the photograph. I informed them of my finding, and I brought them some amount of comfort by providing them with a link to their deceased loved one. They felt a sense of gratitude and were affected by the picture, which depicted their son, their brother, and their husband standing guard over the next generation of Navy aviators. In addition to being a cherished souvenir, the photograph serves as a reminder that even after death, our loved ones are never completely gone. Their spirits continue to be with us, watching over us, guiding us, and reminding us of the connections that bind us, the memories that survive, and the tales that must never be lost. Story 23. In the year 2034, the huge complex of Fort Benning, Georgia, was surrounded by a darkness that was both thick and quiet. The only sound that could be heard was the soft hum of the air conditioning machines as they struggled to keep up with the intense summer heat. The barracks became completely silent and black. The beam of my flashlight was cutting through the darkness as I patrolled the perimeter of the facility while I was on night watch. I was looking for any indication of an infiltration or any flaw in the security measures that were in place. The calm stillness of the night, which is the time for thought, introspection, and listening to the whispers of the earth, has always been a place of comfort for me. My name is Quinn Quick Quintero, and I have always felt at ease in this environment. That night, however, when I heard the gunshots that rang through the air, it was a night that broke the stillness, a night that resonated with the ghosts of a war that had been forgotten. In the beginning, there was a faint crackling, which sounded like the sound of firecrackers in the distance. I came to a halt, my ears strained against the quiet, as I attempted to determine the origin of the sound via my efforts. As the crackling became more audible, it transformed into definite gunshots that were clear and piercing, and they reverberated throughout the night. My pulse was beating in my chest, and my senses were on high alert as I lifted my rifle above my head. I went around the perimeter, looking for any telltale sign of activity or any hint that an assault was taking place. In contrast, there was nothing. Not a single muzzle flash, not a single person in the shadows, and not a single trace of gunfire. The sound of the gunfire continued to reverberate through the deserted streets, reverberating off the walls of the barracks and resulting in a cacophony of sound that filled the night. This was a phantom conflict that was being waged in the shadows, and it seemed as if a combat was taking place just beyond the border of my eyesight. Upon receiving the news of the gunshots, I made contact with the base operations center and sought assistance. They provided a rapid response and sent a patrol unit to the place where I was located. Within minutes, they came with their guns drawn and a gloomy expression on their faces. They too had heard the sound of gunshots. We investigated the area jointly, looking for any indication of the origin of the gunshots by carefully sifting through the streets, the buildings, and the forests that were located in the surrounding region. However, we did not discover anything. Neither expended cartridges nor bullet holes were found, and there was no indication that any rounds had been fired. In the same sudden manner that they had began, the gunshots came to an end, leaving behind a heavy quiet. This silence appeared to intensify the echoes of the phantom gunfire that had been heard before. Our brains were racing with questions as we made our way back to the base operations center and our disquiet was gradually transforming into a gnawing sensation of dread. The security cameras were inspected, the audio recordings were listened to, and we looked for any possible explanation for the gunshot that was heard repeatedly. However, the recordings were devoid of any sound, and the cameras took no pictures. As if the gunshots had never taken place, everything seemed as if not. The explanation that was given by the authorities was that it was a sonic anomaly, which is a peculiar atmospheric phenomena that gave the impression of gunshots, but I was aware of what I had been told. The unmistakable crackle of rifles, the crisp reports of pistols, and the reverberating boom of automatic guns were all sounds that I'd heard. When I heard gunshots, I knew it was accurate. I eventually located it. Near the location where I'd first heard the gunshots, there was a little metal box that was buried under a layer of soil and leaves. The lock on the box was broken, and the contents were revealed. The box had rusted and corroded out. I discovered a few expended cartridges inside the box. The shells of the cartridges were corroded with age, and the markings on the cartridges were odd. I brought the cartridges to the armory of the base and presented them to the weapons expert, who was a grizzled old veteran by the name of Master Sergeant Roscoe Rocky Rhodes. Upon closer inspection, Rocky's eyes widened with recognition as he inspected the cartridges. His statement was that they were weapons from the time of World War I, namely rifles and pistols that had not been used for more than a century. His statement was that these were remnants of a fight that had been forgotten, a training exercise that had been conducted on the exact site where Fort Benning was located at the time. It was then that I became aware that the reverberating gunshots was not only a sound oddity. There was a spectral reminder of the warriors who had trained there, who had fought and died on that precise land, and it was a reverberation of the past. The sacrifice they made, the devotion they showed, and the steadfast commitment they had to honor and duty were all on display before the world. It was a nightly reminder of the ghosts of the past, the men who had gone before us, and the legacy that we were responsible with honoring. That the reverberating gunshots became a frequent occurrence at Fort Benning. The lessons that we learnt included paying attention to the echoes, honoring the memories, and paying tribute to the sacrifices made by those who had prepared the road for us. And by doing so, we discovered a more profound connection to our past, a more robust sense of purpose, and a recommitment to serving our nation, as well as to carrying the torch of democracy and freedom into the future. Story 24. We were surrounded by the thick forest of the Philippines, which was a wall of greenery that was so thick that it was oppressive, and the air was heavy with humidity and the buzzing of insects. The year 2035, Clark Air Base. We were a member of a special operations squad that was participating in a combined training exercise with Filipino soldiers. We were sharpening our abilities in jungle warfare and getting ready for the unknown dangers that the future may bring. Greetings, my name is Sloan Slip Shepherd, and I have always taken great pleasure in my capacity to blend in with my surroundings, to move stealthily, and to become one with the shadows. However, in that forest, the shadows played games on us, obscuring the distinction between fact and fiction. They took away one of our own, leaving behind a gap that could never be replaced. When the event took place, we were deep into the forest, making our way through the thick foliage while keeping our senses on high alert. Simply put, Private First Class Holden Hawk Hart disappeared without a trace. In one instant, he was standing next to me, and in the next, he was gone. It was as if he had just vanished into thin air. Our flashlights were able to penetrate through the darkness as we looked for him, anxiously yelling his name and scouring through the thick undergrowth. On the other hand, there was no trace of him. Not a single trace, not a single broken branch, and not a single clue of his escape. Indeed, it seemed as if the forest itself had completely consumed him. We filed a complaint on his absence, which resulted in the launch of a comprehensive search and rescue effort. Despite the fact that search crews explored the bush and dogs smelled the ground, there was no sign of Hawk anywhere in the jungle. Helicopters circled above. He had just vanished without a trace. Though the days became into weeks, the weeks turned into months, Hawk was still nowhere to be found. He had been lost, walked off, and succumbed to the elements, according to the official account put up by the authorities. We were aware of this fact. When he disappeared, we had been there with him, standing next to him. It was obvious to us that something strange had taken place. When that happened, the sightings began. A fleeting sight of Hawk, reflected in the glossy surface of a canteen, flickering in the shadows of the forest canopy, appearing for a second, and then disappearing just as fast as it appeared. A ghost that haunts the margins of our existence. He was there, but not there. A ghostly presence that haunted the limits of our experience. His face was pale and haggard. His eyes were wide with panic, and his voice was mumbling our names, imploring us to assist him. We began to see him in our nightmares. We began to doubt our own sanity, wondering if we were hallucinating, whether the stress of the jungle, the tragedy of his abduction, was playing tricks on our brains. We began to get concerned that we could be hallucinating. Then I discovered him. Absolutely, without a doubt. His outfit was ripped and ragged, and his body was transparent. He was standing in the midst of a clearing, which was illuminated by the moonlight around him. His eyes were pleading with me, and his lips were twitching, but he did not make any sound. He gazed at me. With a chilly and ghostly touch, he extended his hand to me and allowed it to glide through mine. Following that, he disappeared. After then, I was aware that Hawk was not missing. He had not passed away. He was. It was something else. In addition to being prisoner of the bush, he was also a ghost that haunted the location where he had disappeared. He was caught between two worlds. The memory of Hawk, the inexplicable circumstances surrounding his disappearance, and the terrifying sightings of his ethereal form continued to torment us even as we resumed our training. As we progressed into the forest, we grew more careful, more watchful, and more conscious of the invisible powers that were hiding in the shadows around us. We were able to locate it. The entrance to the secret cave is disguised by the thick foliage that surrounds it, and it is located deep into the forest. Upon entering the cave, we saw a collection of old engravings that depicted weird rituals, alien entities and gateways, portals to other realms, other universes. It was then that we came to the realization that Hawk had discovered one of these portals, which was a doorway to another universe. The only thing that remained behind was a ghostly echo, a haunting reminder of the precarious nature of our existence, the thin barrier that separates us from the unknown. He had been sucked in, taken to another realm, and transported to another world. The last time we saw Hawk was years ago, but we never forgot about him. His legacy continued to live on, serving as a continual reminder of the secrets that are concealed in the shadows of the forest, the invisible forces that influence our world, and the endless possibilities that are beyond our ability to comprehend. Story 25. A shovel scraped against the hard-packed dirt, and the air was heavy with the smell of dust and decay. The ground gave reluctantly, scraping against the hard-packed soil. In the year 2036, the West Point Military Academy is located in New York, in our capacity as members of a construction team. We were charged with the responsibility of rebuilding the foundations of one of the old buildings located on the grounds of the school. To introduce myself, my name is Reeve Rip Ryder, and I have always been interested by history, namely, the tales that are woven into the very fabric of the places that occupy our lives. On the other hand, the time capsule that we discovered on that particular day was a section of history that had not yet occurred, a message from the future. and a horrifying insight into a world that had not yet come into being. The moment we struck anything solid, we were in the process of excavating a trench in preparation for pouring the new concrete footings. It was not rock, it was not rubbish, but rather it included metal. By gently removing the earth, we were able to uncover a little metal box that had a surface that had been tarnished with age and edges that had become corroded by time. A time capsule was what it was. Our interest was piqued, and our imaginations were running wild as we gathered around the time capsule. How many mysteries did it conceal? Which messages from the past were stashed away behind the walls of this rusting structure? We took great care to pry off the lid, and as we did so, our excitement had transformed into a sense of both amazement and perplexity. We discovered a collection of objects when we opened the time capsule. These included photos, letters, and papers, all of which had the insignia of West Point and were all dated 2086.1986. In the future, 50 years from now. While we were examining the contents of the time capsule, our thoughts were racing due to the significance of what we found. The images showed cadets dressed in future clothes, receiving training with cutting-edge weapons, and operating unusual vehicles. Their expressions were bleak, and their eyes seemed to have been hardened by something. Cadets sent letters to their families, portraying a world that had been wrecked by war and was on the verge of collapsing. The letters were packed with a combination of optimism and sorrow, and they described a world that was about to collapse. They talked of a worldwide fight, a war that had transformed the globe, a war that had put country against nation, and a war that had pitted friends against friends. There were official reports and strategic evaluations included among the records. These documents detailed the progression of the conflict, the disastrous results, and the bleak prospects for the future. They talked of a new opponent, a formidable and vicious adversary that had come from the shadows and threatened to drown the whole planet in darkness from the moment it erupted. While our hearts were hammering in our chests and our brains were fighting to fathom the terrible image of the future, we read the letters, the reports, and the papers. There was no message from the past contained inside the time capsule. Not only was it a warning from the future, but it was also a fervent request for assistance and a disturbing insight into a planet that was on the verge of being destroyed. After making our find, we informed the authorities at the school and presented them with the contents of the time capsule. This was the indisputable proof of a future that had not yet come to pass, a future that we had the ability to choose. In spite of their skepticism and lack of belief, they were unable to disagree with the facts. In an effort to find any possible explanation for the time capsule, which contained a message from the future, they initiated a comprehensive inquiry, during which they spoke with historians, scientists, and futurists. There were no answers found throughout the inquiry. There was still a lot of uncertainty around the time capsule. It was a terrifying conundrum, and it was a stern warning from a future that we may still avert. The contents of the time capsule were disseminated to the whole globe with the hope of bringing about a greater awareness of the situation, motivating people to take action, and encouraging the international community to collaborate in order to avert the catastrophic conflict that was represented in the letters, reports, and images. The time capsule evolved into a symbol of optimism, serving as a reminder that the future is not set, that we have the ability to define our own destinies, and that we have the ability to build a society in which peace and prosperity are the norm. The warnings from the future were studied, lessons were learned from the errors made by our ancestors, and we worked relentlessly to construct a better society, a one in which the terrifying vision of the time capsule would never come to reality.